Hi everyone, and welcome to the next installment of Aron Nimzowicz's My System. This time we're going to look at the next of the elements that Nimzowitsch explores in the first part, namely Chapter 2, which covers the open file. In the introduction, Nimzowitsch describes the open file as his favorite amongst the children of his imagination, and adds that he went through much trouble in order to understand the concepts fully. Finally, he points out that the ultimate goal with an open file is to occupy particularly the 7th but also the 8th rank of the board. In order to break down your opponent's resistance on that file, it is also good to have an outpost for a minor piece on that file before you occupy the top 2 ranks with major pieces. Nimzowitsch first defines what in fact the open file is, which is when, of course, your own pawn is absent from the file, or when you have a major piece in front of your pawn on that file. For example, in the position before us here, the B and F files are open, and the H file is open too, but only from H3 onward. And it's important to note that this definition disregards whether or not the heavy pieces are aimed at empty squares or whether they're aimed at enemy pieces, usually pawns. In actual fact, there's no difference in principle between attacking a piece and a square, because, as stated, the ultimate goal is to occupy the top 2 ranks, regardless of whether a capture is made in taking that square in the process. And attaining the desired square is simply a matter of attacking it more times than it is defended and moving the desired piece to the square in question. If there is a piece or a pawn on that square, then we must first render it as immobile as possible before carrying out the attack. Now rook takes b7 here immediately occupies the 7th rank and is the strongest move. Okay, on to the next one. And this section is called How Open Files Are Born. Naturally, Nimzowitsch writes, it can be seen that files become open with the disappearance of one of our pawns. When one of these pawns disappears, then a file is open for us. And there are several ways that this can happen. For instance, after the moves e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, bishop c5, d3, d6, knight c3, knight f6. If white were now to play bishop e3, encouraging black to exchange bishops here, bishop takes e3, f takes e3, and now the f file is open for white. And Nimzowitsch stresses that it's far more likely our opponent, if he understands anything about chess, will be compelled to exchange like this when we have a piece well posted in the center of the board, like the bishop was here on e3, as opposed to on the flank where the other bishop was here on c5. And our opponent will be less obliged to exchange if our pieces are on the flank, because a piece there is not so powerfully placed as a piece in the center. A deeper example of this can be seen in this game of Alekhine's, which was played against Thomas, played at Baden-Baden in 1925. Alekhine, with the black pieces here, has posted his knights very strongly in the center, and Thomas was compelled to exchange after Alekhine's knight d4. Here these well posted central knights. After knight takes d4, with c takes d4, which opens this c file for black. And immediately there's some pressure on the c2 pawn, and this will be of course occupying the 7th rank from black's perspective if he's to get a piece down here. And analyzing the initial position at knight d4, we may have been disinclined to go down this route, because after knight takes d4, c takes d4, knight takes d5, queen takes d5, there's bishop f3, which can be played and is virtually forced, or white is faced with an inferior position and nasty pressure. Black will have to move the queen and protect the bishop in one move, so queen d7 is forced, and after bishop takes b7, queen takes b7, you know, looking at the initial position, we could foresee this if we could see reasonably far ahead. And from here it seems that, you know, much of the pressure that black had upon white is gone, and you know, what can possibly be hoped for from this position for black. But this continuation really shows the depth of Alekhine's understanding, as this c-file will become critical very quickly for white, and in actual fact there's no way to maintain this pawn on c2, so Thomas was compelled to advance immediately with c4, which gives Alekhine just one chance to take en passant, which he gladly did with d takes c3, and this move also opens the d file for black, which he can now, you know, attack the d3 pawn as well, so one weakness has led to another. And after b takes c3 he just played rook a c8, and he followed up with rook f d8, and you know, he gained very strong play on both of these open files and he won a nice game. So the moral of this section is to position your pieces centrally, just as long as they cannot be knocked around by pawns, and your opponent may well be encouraged to exchange them off, opening files that you can later use to gain an advantage. If they don't trade off central pieces, then you will be permitted to keep well posted pieces on the board, which you know is equally good. Okay, so let's go back to the position now we looked at a moment ago. Yeah, we just played bishop e3 here, and so let's say instead of exchanging on e3, black plays bishop b6, and you know, we can continue with queen d2 castles, and now white castles long. And now let's say, for the sake of argument, black plays the dubious move h6, and this move is dubious because in opposite sides castling positions it's generally very unwise to make weakening pawn moves like this. White is now almost immediately threatening to sacrifice on h6 for a mating attack. However, for this exercise we are talking about open files, and that's another reason why h6 is bad. It makes it a lot easier for white to open lines into the black king. Specifically, it is now easy for white to bring about the disappearance of his g-pawn, and thus to open the g-file simply by playing h3 and following up with g4 and g5, and you know, if necessary g6, because this f7 pawn is pinned. And you know, there's no way for black to prevent this, so he's made his life much more difficult by playing h6 here. So now let's say that instead of h6 black had played g6. Yeah, so same position, and we've removed the dark squared bishops from the board as well, just to make it a bit easier. And black has played g6 instead of h6. So now g6 becomes the target to be attacked, and the h file becomes the one to open. And it's, you know, it's always the file next to the object of attack that gets opened, because pawns capture diagonally. So for example, after h4 we can't immediately play h5 due to the knight here on f6, you know, unless we want to sacrifice something. So before playing h5 we could play knight d5. So yeah, and that's how we'd progress here. Knight d5, then we can trade on f6, play h5, open h file, and attack the black king. And it's good to note as well that black can't play after h5 g5, simply because white is controlling g5 with his pieces, so the pawn will just be lost. And yeah, so that's the correct way to play, generally speaking, against weakening pawn moves in opposite sides castling, and how to open files. You know, you advance pawn next to the pawn that your opponent has advanced, and then just simply take and you get activity down the file. The next section is entitled "The Ideal Purpose Behind All Operations on a File," with the subtitles "Less Important Accompanying Phenomena" and "Flanking Attacks." Nimzowitsch writes, just give me 1 second here. The idea behind any operation on a file consists of finally penetrating via that file into the opponent's position, in other words, onto the 7th or 8th rank. This is a very important rule. In stating it, we should emphasize via that file, because if, for example, we had been active on the D file and then reached the 7th rank in a roundabout way by moves such as rook d1 to d4 to a4 to a7, I do not consider the maneuver I have just described to be a direct exploitation of the D file. So Nimzowicz's point is that if we're using a file, the direct exploitation of that file is to move straight to the 7th rank on that file, but if we move halfway up the file and then across and then up to the 7th rank on another file, it's indirect use of that file. And you know, he continues with some elementary examples, and here it's white to move, and this H file is looking very strong, and so it can be seized decisively with playing Queen H1 immediately. Oops, hold on a second. Yeah, it can be seized immediately with Queen H1, forcing King G8, and now, according to the rule, we want to occupy either the 7th or 8th rank. Of course, the 7th one is the one to choose here, so Queen H7 check, forcing King F8, and now the 8th rank is decisive thanks to the loose black queen. So King E7, Queen takes B8, and this type of maneuver is what Nimzowitsch classified as a marauding attack, and he stresses that ideas such as these are typical examples of what happens when one penetrates so deep into the enemy position with heavy pieces. So now we have the same position, except that the black queen is on D7 instead of B8. And if you want to try and figure out the correct mode of progression, then stop the video now. Queen H1 check is again the correct first move, of course. So King G8, now Queen H7 check, forcing King F8. Queen H8 check, again forcing King E7, and now Queen takes G7 check. Followed by, you know, any king move is tied to defending the queen anyway, so say King D8, and now Queen takes D7, King takes D7, and G7. This pawn is going to Queen. Nimzowitsch emphasizes the manner in which the white queen attacks here, i.e. by checking via H7 and H8, and then crucially winning the pawn on G7, and denotes it as a flanking movement or attack, as white is attacking from the flank and forcing the king out into the open. He summarizes what has been covered in saying that when there is no resistance down the desired file, such as pawns in the way of operations, the attacker will secure the entry squares and penetrate to the best available square, ideally carrying out a marauding or flanking attack, which are both effective against undeveloped minor pieces too, even with the rook. If you can penetrate with the 8th rank with the rook and there's undeveloped pieces here, then you're in business. He finishes by pointing out that this whole matter might seem simple and easy to understand and achieve, but adds that in reality there are major obstacles to be overcome, as the next section will demonstrate. Okay, that's the end of part 1.